My name is John Lobell. I teach architecture at Pratt Institute. I blog at creativitydiscourse.com, review movies from a mythological point of view at cinemadiscourse.com, and you can reach me at johnlobell@mac.com. This is a lecture for first-year architectural history on the history of gardens. Gardens and landscape architecture. So why do we talk about gardens and landscape architecture? The idea is as follows. With each period, you have sort of a vision of how they want to organize space. And do we want boulevards? Do we want squares? We have the Renaissance Square in front of the Foundling Hospital of Brunelleschi. What's their notion of the civic space in which the culture wants to engage? And let's say they have a notion. Well, it's kind of hard to do it in the city because there's already people living there. And no matter how powerful and wealthy a king is, there's a limit to how much they can push people around to engage in this vision. But if you go out in the middle of nowhere or some less populated area of the city, you can make a park, a landscape, and in so doing incorporate these ideas of the kind of space, the stage on which that culture wants to engage. And so the landscape architecture provides an ideal setting for that can't always be achieved in cities due to the fact that there's already existing buildings and settlement. Now, we're going to look at only 4 periods, which is the black, but the blue I'll just briefly mention. And so the kind of worldview of each of these cultures is manifest in space in their gardens, which is the point I want to make. And we won't pause to note all this down because we'll look at each one as we go. But if I don't cover some of these terms, when you download the lecture, you can use them, use this to fill in your notes. So when you go to the Metropolitan Museum, we have these beautiful little models from a tomb of a home of a modest person, not a poor peasant, but not a pharaoh either. And this is their home, and then this is their garden with their fig trees, etc. And we take this as a model for how they saw their world, and we see these depictions of them. Remember we said of the Egyptians, very domestic, very kind of making a very human landscape for themselves. For Rome, we have the great palaces, and then we also have Pompeii, where we have everything intact, and so we can see the courtyards of the buildings again with plantings and fountains. Islam, the garden, is very important, symbolic of the Garden of Paradise. We see these 4 quarters everywhere, but here it's the 4 rivers converging on Jerusalem, and the importance of the garden because even though Islam is spread around the world, it originated in this hot desert climate, and so the oasis garden is a place of coolness and escape from the desert. And we recall when we go to the Alhambra, the temperature drops maybe 10 or 15 degrees just from the evaporative cooling of these fountains in these gardens. So we'll start with medieval, and we'll describe the medieval worldview of one of no uniform space and time. It's kind of negative, right? And all of the senses are engaged, and so we have a holistic notion. So here's a ideal medieval city, and we see it does not have perspective. It does not have a uniform space. If you were challenged to build a model of this, you could. It's this artist has clearly rendered the space, but it's not using perspective. So we see the windows here closer to us are no bigger than the windows here far away from us, because it's not us that counts, it's God's view and not our view. So we do not have a personal point of view giving us a uniform space and a perspective distance from me, the viewer, because this sense of me is not present for them. Medieval garden is walled, has irregular squares, lacks a strong geometry. They grew herbs for cooking and medicine, and it's modeled on the Garden of Eden. Now again, instructors are not permitted, but how many people have been to a medieval garden? Okay, how many people have visited the Cloisters in Upper Manhattan? You've been to a medieval garden. The Cloisters has a whole series of medieval gardens. If you have not been there, put it on your to-do list. It is an extension of the Metropolitan Museum, and it is a series of cloisters and medieval buildings that the Rockefellers brought over here stone by stone and reassembled. It's just written up in the Times a couple of days ago. They're going to be showing more contemporary art there. But it's a lot of the medieval collection of the Met. And you go to the gardens there, and it's all labeled, and they're growing herbs that you would use in your kitchen. So a medieval housewife would have a garden, and that's where she would grow the herbs for cooking and for medical healing. No drugstores, you grew your own. So there are none of these surviving because they were quite modest, and there's been 1,000 years of stuff happening since then. But we see them in books of hours. There are these medieval books that will have illustrations of these gardens. So here's one showing Mary and baby Jesus in a garden that's maybe modeled on Garden of Eden. And so we see it is walled and has a series of squares that are usually not that rigorously regulated. They're not that concerned about getting everything to line up. Here's another one from a manuscript. This is where in medieval chivalry, the young man courts his young woman. Anybody know what the dog is symbolic of? Faithfulness. So when we, we sort of enrich our learnings of these other cultures as we learn what all these little things mean. Another one where we see sort of walled, and then here are squares that have, again, plantings for herbs and spices and medicines. This is the Plan of Sangal. A magnificent book was published of this. It's an ideal monastery. Some of it was built, but not all of this. And it was a monastery with... Now, during the Romanesque era, or this is a little bit earlier, early Christian era, Europe was in chaos, and the monasteries were places of refuge, and they were whole operations. They had crafts, and they'd make beer or cheese or other foods, wine. They had gardens and workshops and etc. So we see all that in the Plan of Sangal, including its gardens. Okay, the Renaissance. This is going to be very brief. The Renaissance is rich, particularly Italian Renaissance, with gardens, but we'll only look at one. But with the Renaissance, we have uniform space and time. So we get a convergence of Isaac Newton's notion of space and time and perspective painting. So in this ideal city, we have perspective. And so We are observing it. We have a position. We have a point of view. The height of our eyes is the horizon line, and then all parallel lines converge at a given point, so that there is a uniform space and time in which things can be set. So we have perspective leading to geometric regularity, and so here the artist is giving us these pavings to help us see this uniform space and the convergence of perspective. So Renaissance gardens are typically associated with the villas of the emerging wealthy, wealth often coming from trade and banking in Florence and then Rome. Strong, regular geometry, uniform space like that in perspective. But in contrast to what we'll see next, the Baroque, the space is bounded and not extending to infinity. Now, I didn't go into this extending to infinity in our discussion of the Baroque for the Italian Baroque, because we'll see that in 2 weeks when we look at the French Baroque, where that really comes into play. So this is Villa d'Este in Tivoli near Rome. So it's commissioned by a cardinal, and we have a palatial setting surrounded by spectacular terrace gardens, late Renaissance, somewhat Mannerist style. Very important feature of these gardens is waterworks, which is requiring engineering, getting up into the hills to get the water higher up. That's going to give you the pressure to run your fountains. And we also see this notion of the human dominance of the landscape. So what's the key geographical feature of this site before anybody gets here? It's sloping down this way. They totally ignore that. There's this pattern running across it. They just, well, we'll just have to tilt this up. But there's no change. You know, we got this square here, but totally ignoring the natural features of the landscape, this human geometric domination being more important than the natural. Remember what we said about, say, the Japanese relationship to the landscape. This is very different. So it does have a spectacular hill, but we're not, we're not engaging it. We're sort of running roughshod over it. Rich with waterworks, and so we're getting pretty good at engineering now. This is not trivial stuff to pipe in this water, keep it under pressure, and get these fountains resulting. This is going to become highly developed a few years later with Versailles. Imagine a world in which we don't have public swimming pools. We do not have hot and cold running water in our apartments. So that water is just this luxury. And to be able to have it and display it like this. Here it is in a Romantic era painting. And here we are in Heidelberg. These things originate in Florence, go to Rome, and then spread around Europe, just as the way the Gothic originated in France and then spread around Europe. And here we see again a managing to ignore this, the landscape. Now we're going to see in a after the Baroque, the English landscape, they would eat this up. They would say, look at these fantastic natural features. How are we going to incorporate them? And the Renaissance architects are saying, how can we sort of pretend they're not there? Okay, the Baroque. We just looked at the Baroque, and so we have the ideas of exuberance, emotionality, grandeur, making things bigger. extension to infinity, and emotionality. So here we have another assumption of the Virgin with the spectacular activity of the painting. So our most famous example that we'll be seeing quite a bit of in 2 weeks is Versailles. So the gardens retains features of the Renaissance, but it gets bigger. Now this is in part because these Italian Renaissance families were one of many competing figures in a city like Florence or Rome. When we get to Versailles, there's only one, and he's got a whole country, so that the amount of wealth is far greater than what they had for these Renaissance gardens. So they get bigger and grander. Extension to infinity. Of course, they don't extend to infinity, but here is the Palace of Versailles, and then the gardens, and then the canal. And when you're standing here and you look, is sort of a little play with the trees up here to sort of fool you into thinking it keeps going. And so the extent of the rule of the absolute ruler is infinite, but we also now have a notion of an infinite universe is in Newtonian physics. We have, this is reflective of the absolute monarchy, and we get new technologies and developments of modern science. So the story of Versailles always begins with the Chateau of Vaux-le-Vicomte, and I'm going to let Iris tell you the story in 2 weeks, but it's a lot of fun. But Vaux-le-Vicomte did this quite handsome garden, and Louis XIV took off on that idea, and using the same figures, so the architects are Lobell and Massart, and the gardens are André Le Nôtre. So he's the great French Baroque landscape architect. Here again we've got, it's quite a grand palace, but tiny here, and this engagement with a huge aspect of the landscape. And then here are the stables for the horses, and it's symbolic of Louis XIV is the Sun King, and the palace is a chariot, and the horses are drawing the chariot. So there's an idea that goes way back to the Indo-Europeans that spread from India to Scandinavia, and then these boulevards go to Paris. So we have this huge connectedness, and here we are looking out in a rendering at the time. What they experienced then is very different from what we experience now. I'm sure all these trees are dead and gone, but even the trees that replace them are huge, and they were thought of as much more controlled at the time, but now they're more luxuriant because they've become quite mature. And here you see this sense of, it doesn't look like it stops. And this idea of extension to infinity, and our boulevards, our diagonal boulevards going everywhere. Here are the stables, here's the palace. And the palace keeps expanding. And as we saw in the Renaissance, even more so now, this extreme control of nature. This all should be greener, but this extreme control of nature, of molding the trees as topiaries and all the hedges being controlled and made into human-designed filigrees, rather than letting it express its naturalness. Here's our Grand Canal. And this is what's going on inside. So this again spreads. Every European monarch has to have one. So here's one in Germany. The next movement is the picturesque. There's a lot of terms for this. Picturesque, romantic, or English garden. So we now have the aesthetic of the sublime. And with the Renaissance, we introduced this Renaissance humanism. We introduced the notion of rational science, that the world is understandable through the human faculties of observation, and then taking your observations and working them mathematically. And moving into our Baroque period, where that continues, the ultimate expression of that is Isaac Newton and Newtonian physics. And we then, some years later, actually at the time of Napoleon, we have Laplace, a follower of Newton, saying that with a powerful enough computer, I can, and knowing the position and velocity of every particle in the universe, I could retrodict everything that ever happened and predict all the future. It's like saying, if I see how the billiard balls are moving on the table, I know this one hits that one, it'll bounce and hit that one, and it's all predictable and understandable. Even when you introduce emotion, there's a science of emotion in the Baroque. Well, now we're in a period of I don't say recognition, that implies they're right and the others are wrong, but a notion that there are qualities of nature that transcend our ability to understand and control them. And there are qualities of the human emotions that are so terrifying, so frightening, so beautiful, that they transcend anything that we can, any rational attempt to understand them. And the term of the system of aesthetics based on this is called the Sublime. Quality of greatness or vast magnitude, whether physical, moral, intellectual, metaphysical, or artistic, often used to refer to nature and its vastness. So this is a painter, Caspar David Friedrich, Wanderer Above the Sea of Fog. We're sure this young man is a poet. And he's hiking across the Pyrenees or the Alps or something. And in his heart are these overpowering emotions as he sees the grandeur of nature. This is a painting by Turner, and whether he's painting storms and shipwrecks, and it's just, you think you can build a ship that takes on the ocean? The ocean will break it up like matchsticks. And so this notion of the grandeur and power, but look at how beautiful it is. You get a storm, or you get the Houses of Parliament on fire, which he painted, all that clouds or pollution in the air is going to make magnificent sky effects. There's a magazine called New York Magazine. The very first issue of New York Magazine was on the beauties of pollution. This came out in the 70s before the air. The air has really been cleaned up a lot since 40 years ago, and but you'd get you get a sunrise with really dense smog in the air. You get spectacular effects. There's a whole portfolio of the beauty of pollution, and so that's what we see here. That is churning and threatening as the sky is, but it's also magnificent due to what it does to the qualities of the sunlight coming through it. So, the picturesque, romantic, or English garden challenges the humanist notions of the Renaissance Baroque, the notion that we can rationally understand and control this stuff, whether it's nature or our own emotions, replacing the humanist aesthetic with that of the sublime, an interest in nature. Now, we put nature in quotes because, oh, there's a bunch of trees out there, that must be nature. That's not a sophisticated understanding of nature. In a sense, everything is nature. I mean, the plastic of this computer is nature, right? It comes from molecules, they're part of nature. So, but we sort of know what we mean when we say nature. We should be careful. It's not a technical term. And this also includes a nostalgia for the past and distant cultures. What's going on in the mysterious East? What's going on in China? Oh, those Romans, what it must have been like to be there during the debates in the Senate, to have been reading Ovid and etc. So we have on our English estate a little Roman temple. So we'll look at Stowe in Buckinghamshire, England. And here we see these natural, irregular, asymmetrical landscape or meandering paths or fields. Now, my apologies for these not being great slides, but here is the original natural. It's kind of messy, and then we bring in the architect to clean it up. Wrong. It was actually the other way around. This is the old-fashioned Baroque gardens with their formal axial control of nature, and they brought in a landscape architect to make it look natural. That's the new aesthetic, to look natural. Now, this is not Capability Brown, but the key landscape architect who did this was called Capability Brown. And his name was Brown, and when brought in by an English lord to say, well, what can you do with these out-of-fashion Baroque boulevards that I have here, Brown would say, my lord, your estate has great capabilities, by which he meant potential. I can really fix this up for a big fee. And they made them look natural like this. And so this is not, the original natural. This is human-made to look natural. And so we even carefully stage these views. You're walking with a companion talking about world politics, or with a young man and a young woman, and you come around the corner and just pops into your view a little Roman temple, or this bridge, or this little Palladian thingy here. And so all these accidents, all these clumpings of trees, and all these rules that you have a little hill, you want 5 or 7 trees, never an even number. Remember those Japanese slides? We told you the rules, so that it shouldn't look human-made. It's got to look natural. And then you put a cow here and 3 cows over there. Even the cows are displayed, to be part of this natural landscape. And then there's something called ha-has, which is you're riding along with your horse and suddenly it goes over into a ditch and you break your leg. Because instead of putting up fences would break things up. So you, in order to keep the cattle from wandering off, you put a ditch there that you can't see. And then you say, ha-ha, you just went over the thing and broke your leg. So all this human-made naturalness. Stourhead is another one of these. Now, there's a whole story here about English aristocratic society, and what's one family doing with 2,650 acres, including a village that they own. That's another story. But Stourhead is Wiltshire, England. And again, we get these natural landscapes and Roman temples. The idea that right here, this pops out with a red maple. That's not an accident. It's totally deliberately laid out by the, and then you get a few swans. And then a Palladian mansion and some Roman temples on the site. And maybe even the exoticness of the East. So you get you have a little handbook and you pick which Chinese temples you want on your landscape. Now, how many people have seen an English garden? And the answer is all of us, because we've got one right here, Central Park. It's later in time, but it's in that style. So you walk through Central Park and you say, gee, isn't it great that they preserved this chunk of nature in the middle of this city? That's not what happened. It's all designed. And so the great landscape architect Olmsted, Frederick Law Olmsted, working with Calvert Vaux, but we credit Olmsted with this, designed Central Park. And of course it was a vast venture involving the cities making this determination to have this great thing in the middle of New York. And after the success of this, they're all over. I mean, Olmsted is hugely influential in cities all over the United States, part of the City Beautiful movement. Where is there a park by Olmsted that's far larger than Central Park? Anybody ever been to Prospect Park? Right here in Brooklyn. We got one in Brooklyn. It's even much bigger than Central Park by Olmsted. So here is Central Park in Manhattan. And you can see the commitment of the, one guy doesn't come along and say, oh, let's knock out the center of the city. There's a huge civic commitment at this time to improving the cities. Now, that's it. There are just a couple more that I won't go into detail, but just to let you know that the notion of landscape continues. It's still engaged with our architecture, so jumping into next semester. We've got modern landscapes, some of which are rational. So here is Ville Radieuse by Le Corbusier, and the kind of rational control of landscape. This is postmodern by Robert Venturi, his proposal that was not built for Copley Square. So this is the Boston Public Library. This is it Trinity Church? By Richardson, thank you. And so there's a square there. What to do with it? It's been sitting there for decades. And Venturi, just to give you this notion of humor in architecture, he says, well, open space is good because the city's so dense, the relief of a piece of open space. But at the same time, open space is bad because you come down the street and look at how the walls of these buildings define the street. And then here, there's like a missing tooth. There's just like you're walking along and you just fall in there. There's a hole there. So how do you make a wall that's there but not there? And the answer is trees. So trees give you the visual barrier to define the street, but you can walk through them. Then he's got large and small trees which when mature are the same. So they're just off scale. It's just like, there's something bothering me about this. And then he says, okay, we should reproduce the grid of the city in here, in our paths, but of course we want to be able to cut diagonally across. So that's like Broadway, cutting diagonally through Manhattan. And so every square is the same, this uniform grid, but everyone's different because when we cut through here, it makes this one different, this one different. So rules and exceptions. And so there's just this rich play of all these ideas making this rich landscape. There's a movement in architect we'll talk about next year, deconstruction. And so we take as our deconstructivist. Now there's deconstructivism and deconstructionism. Worry about that next semester. But Parc la Violette by Bernard Tschumi, who was dean at Columbia around this time, of building this. And he's got a grid of pavilions spotted in there. And then each pavilion takes on a sort of different use. Now, one of the great modern landscape architects is one of my professors at Penn, Ian McHarg, and he said, you can't judge a garden for 10 or 20 years because not only do the trees have to grow, but people have to sort of absorb into it, become part of their lives, and may not be successful, may or may not be successful, but you can't tell on day one. So I said, okay, I'm not going to look at La Violette for 10 years. I got to go to Paris and look at it. But I happened to be there. So I said, okay, I'm going to look at it. And I thought it was great. I thought it was really successful. But you just cannot tell from looking at photos and plans. You've got to, you have to be there and then have a sense of how people's lives grow into it. Now, just end up with something that we'll look at in some detail with our lecture on Baroque cities coming in a few weeks, the Tuileries Garden and the Louvre in Paris. So here's the Louvre, here's the Tuileries Gardens built outside, Renaissance, and then Louvre is extended, and this breaks out, Baroque. So here is the Louvre. Here are the Tuileries Gardens, ending at this little La Ronde, this rounded wall. Here it breaks out in the Baroque, by Le Notre. We get our Baroque boulevards, and here it is then coming all the way Place de la Concorde coming all the way to the Place de la Concorde, and then continuing on to the new extensions to Paris, and finally, and all that's right here. And then we have the two great lungs of Paris, Bois de Vincennes, Vincennes Park, and Bois de Boulogne. Bois de Vincennes and Bois de Boulogne.